Let them finish it out there. Colonel Hartwick said those 6 words, set the phone down, and straightened his tie. 12 Navy SEALs were bleeding out in an alley on Christmas Eve, screaming into a radio that he had just silenced with his own hand. Not a malfunction, not a system failure, his hand. He physically reached across the console and killed the signal while they were still talking. Then he turned to the window, calm, unbothered, like he just closed a tab on his computer. 20 men, abandoned, Christmas Eve. And the only person who moved to save them was a woman who wasn't even supposed to be there. Subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this truth travels. The mission brief had been clean, too clean. That was the first thing Master Chief Daniel Dagger Reyes noticed when Alpha 6 assembled in the briefing room at 2100 hours on December 23rd. The room smelled like stale coffee and fluorescent light, and the intelligence officer standing at the front of the room spoke with the kind of calm confidence that only people who've never been shot at can manage. Reyes sat in the second row with his arms crossed, listening to words like minimal resistance and low probability of engagement and in and out in under 40 minutes, and he felt something cold settle in the base of his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "Feels light," said Petty Officer Marcus Webb, leaning over from the seat beside him, voice just barely above a whisper. Marcus had been Reyes's swim buddy since Bud/S, back when they were both 22 years old and half crazy from sleep deprivation and cold water. He had the kind of instincts that didn't come from training. They came from surviving things training couldn't prepare you for. "Yeah," Reyes said, eyes still on the map projected on the wall. "It does." The target was a weapons cache in the Haroon district, a dense residential grid of narrow alleys, shared walls, and buildings so close together you could pass a cup of tea from one window to the next without leaning. Intelligence suggested the cache was being managed by a mid-level logistics coordinator named Yusuf Karimi. 12 men, one objective, a 4-hour window beginning at 0200 Christmas Eve morning. Simple. Reyes had been on enough missions to know that simple was just the word they used right before things went sideways. He raised his hand. "What's the QRF situation?" The intelligence officer clicked to the next slide. "Quick Reaction Force will be on standby at FOB Kestrel, approximately 14 minutes out." 14 minutes is a long time in a tight alley. "The assessment is that you won't need them, Master Chief." Reyes looked at the map again, at the narrow streets, at the density of the residential block, at the single extraction route marked in blue. "Right," he said, and said nothing else. 3 hours later, Alpha 6 was wheels up, pressed into the cold metal interior of a Blackhawk. Weapons loaded, comms checked, and every man wearing the particular expression of someone who has made peace with the fact that tonight might be the last night. Not because they were afraid, but because that was what professionals did. They acknowledged the math and then went anyway. The insertion was clean. Nobody shot at them. The streets were quiet in that specific way that streets in hostile territory get quiet. Not peaceful, but held, like a breath being deliberately withheld. Reyes moved his team through 2 blocks without contact, hand signals flowing between them like a second language. And for about 7 minutes, he actually allowed himself to think maybe the intel was right. Then Petty Officer Cliff Torres, on point, put up a fist. Everyone stopped. Torres didn't turn around. He just held the fist up, knuckles white, and then slowly raised 2 fingers, pointed left, then 3 fingers, pointed right. Reyes moved up beside him and looked down the alley and felt his stomach drop clean through the floor. There were men positioned on both sides of the street ahead. Not civilians, not militia. These were trained fighters in coordinated overwatch positions. And they were already in place, already waiting. And the way they were positioned, covering angles, minimizing exposure, staging in depth, told Reyes everything he needed to know in about 4 seconds. This was not a weapons cache security detail. This was an ambush. Command, this is Alpha 6 Actual, he said into the radio, pulling back against the wall, voice low and steady. We have eyes on what looks like a deliberate blocking position. These aren't guards. I'm counting at least 18, possibly more in depth. We are requesting permission to abort and exfil on primary route. Over. The radio crackled. For 3 long seconds, nothing. Then, Alpha 6, this is Command. Confirm your position and hold. We are assessing the situation. Assessing the situation, Reyes repeated the words quietly to himself, the way you might repeat something in a language you don't quite speak. They're assessing the situation, he said, looking at Torres. Torres looked back at him with an expression that said everything both of them were thinking. They had maybe 90 seconds before whatever had been waiting in that alley realized that Alpha 6 had stopped moving. In a coordinated ambush, and this was coordinated, Reyes was certain of it now, that meant the flanking elements would start to close. They would tighten the net, and 12 men in a narrow alley with one exit point would become 12 men in a body bag before QRF could get their boots on. Command, we do not have time to hold. I need a decision. We abort or we push through. And if we push through, we are going to make contact in approximately 60 seconds. What is your call? Over. Alpha 6, hold your position. Command is conferring. Conferring? Reyes looked at his men, 12 faces in the dark watching him. Webb was running his thumb along the grip of his rifle with the particular nervous energy of a man trying very hard to look like he wasn't nervous. Torres had already shifted position, instinctively covering the left side of the alley. Corpsman First Class Eddie Galvin, their medic, was pressed against the wall 2 men back, and he met Reyes's eyes with a question he didn't say out loud. They're conferring, Reyes told them. Nobody laughed. It wasn't that kind of moment. Then the shooting started. Not at them, not yet. A burst of automatic fire came from somewhere deeper in the residential block. A deliberate trigger meant to flush them forward or backward, designed to force movement. Lights flickered on in windows overhead. Somewhere a child cried out, quickly hushed. "Contact rear!" shouted Petty Officer Leo Vasquez from the back of the formation. And just like that, they were in it. The next 4 minutes were the kind of 4 minutes that people who weren't there can't really understand, and people who were there never quite shake. Alpha 6 fought with everything they had, disciplined, controlled, professional, every man doing exactly what he'd been trained to do. They moved, they communicated, they used cover, they conserved ammunition with the grim economy of people who know the math is already working against them. Reyes called contact reports into the radio with one part of his brain, while the rest of it was tracking angles, tracking his men, tracking the closing ring of enemy fighters who were moving with a patience and coordination that told him these weren't amateurs. Alpha 6, this is Command. Maintain your position. Extraction is being coordinated. Command, we cannot maintain this position. We have contact from 3 sides and closing from a 4th. I need QRF now. I need air support. I need something. Over. Silence. Then, Alpha 6, be advised, QRF is not available at this time. Reyes heard the words, and for 1 full second he genuinely believed he had misunderstood them. He pressed the radio handset harder against his ear, as if proximity might change what he just heard. Command, say again. Did you say QRF is not available? That is correct. QRF has been stood down. You are to hold your current position and await further instruction. Webb appeared at his shoulder, blood running down the side of his face from a graze above his ear. He was still shooting, left-handed, rifle up, eyes forward, but he turned just enough to look at Reyes, and his expression said, "Tell me I heard that wrong." Reyes shook his head once. Webb turned back to the fight and said, very quietly, a word that cannot be repeated in polite company. "Command," Reyes said, and he worked very hard to keep his voice level. "I have men wounded. I have contact on 4 sides. I do not have a viable defensive position, and I am burning ammunition. If QRF is stood down and you are not sending air support, then you need to tell me right now what my options are, because right now my options are fight or die, and I am not willing to choose die. Over. A pause that lasted long enough for Torres to reload, for Galvin to drag a wounded man behind a concrete barrier, for two more enemy fighters to try and push the left flank and get driven back by disciplined fire. Alpha 6, this is Colonel Hartwick. The voice was different now, older, measured in a way that was distinct from calm. It was the measured quality of someone who had already made their decision and was simply announcing it. I understand your situation. I want you to know that the extraction helicopters have been redirected. There is a diplomatic situation unfolding that requires we minimize our footprint in the Haroun district tonight. Your mission has been compromised, and the risk of escalation is considered unacceptable. You are ordered to hold your position and reduce engagement to the minimum necessary to maintain your location. Reyes stared at the radio. Hold our position, he said. That is correct. Colonel, sir, we cannot hold this position. We will be overrun. These men will die. Master Chief, I understand that this is a difficult situation. With respect, sir, no, you do not. Because if you understood the situation, you would not be ordering 12 men to stand in place and get killed. His voice had moved past professional now into something raw, something that had no patience left for careful language. You are asking us to hold still while they close in. That is not a military order. That is an execution. The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest thing Reyes had ever heard. Then, those are your orders, Master Chief. Command out. The radio went dead. Reyes lowered it slowly. Around him, his men were still fighting, still doing their jobs, still trusting that the chain of command was working something out, coordinating something, that there was a plan being executed above their pay grade that would result in them getting out of this alley alive. They trusted him, and he had just listened to a colonel in a warm room tell him that those 12 lives had been calculated and found expendable. He put the radio back on his vest. What did they say? Webb asked, still firing. Reyes thought about lying. He genuinely thought about it for one full second, considered what a lie would do. Buy a few minutes of morale before the truth became undeniable. Then he decided that these men, who had followed him into this alley, who were bleeding in this alley, deserved the truth. They stood down QRF. Helicopters are gone. They want us to hold position. The fighting continued for a moment in the exact same rhythm before what he'd said registered. Then Webb turned. Then Torres turned from the front. Then one by one, eyes found him in the dark. Gone, said Torres. Like gone, gone? Gone. The whole time we've been in this alley, they've been... Webb stopped himself. He looked at Reyes with an expression that had moved through disbelief and arrived somewhere harder. They're not coming. No, they left us here. Reyes didn't answer that. He looked at his men, 12 men, all of them looking back at him, and he made a decision. Not because command had authorized it, not because there was a protocol for it, but because there was absolutely nothing left that a rule book could do for them now. We are not standing still, he said. Change of plan. We push northeast. Torres, you're on point. Webb, cover rear. Galvin, how's Ramirez? Ambulatory. He'll make it if we move. Then we move. No more radio calls. We're going to find our own way out of this. He said it with more certainty than he felt. That was also part of leadership, the part nobody talked about, the part that meant projecting a confidence you were manufacturing in real time, because 12 men following you through an ambush needed something to follow. They started moving. And 6 blocks north, on a rooftop that no one had authorized her to be on, Specialist Sarah Vance pressed her eye to her scope and watched them. She had not been part of the operation. Officially, she wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the Haroun district that night. She was on restricted duty pending a disciplinary review, the kind of official language that meant she was in trouble but hadn't been charged with anything yet. She'd been ordered to remain on base, to keep her head down, to let the paperwork process, and wait for the system to decide what to do with her. The restricted duty had lasted until approximately 2,200 hours, when her radio had picked up Alpha 6's first contact report, and she had heard, in the voice of Master Chief Reyes, something she recognized. Not fear, something worse than fear. The particular sound of someone who is professionally calm and has just realized that professional calm might not be enough. She had been out of her quarters in under a minute. It had taken her 40 minutes to reach her current position, a rooftop overlooking a 6-block radius of the Haroon district, reached without authorization, without radio check-in, without any of the proper channels that a soldier on restricted duty was supposed to go through. She had moved through the dark with the particular efficient invisibility that snipers develop over years, carrying her rifle and her rangefinder and nothing else. And she had found her position, and she had been watching ever since. What she saw through her scope made her jaw tighten. Alpha 6 was moving northeast. They were fighting well, conserving ammo, communicating, covering each other's movement. But the enemy element had the numbers and the ground knowledge, and they were closing in from 3 directions with a patience that told Sarah something very important. They were not trying to kill Alpha 6 quickly. They were hurting them, pushing them toward a choke point in the street grid 3 blocks north where the alley narrowed to a single lane between 2 buildings, and there was nowhere to turn. They were going to funnel them in and finish it there. Sarah had been running the geometry in her head for 4 minutes. She had a clear sight line on 8 of the enemy fighters managing the encirclement. She knew where the 4th side element was breaking cover to advance. She could see the choke point. She could see the timing. She also knew that the moment she pulled the trigger, she was not just violating her restricted duty. She was not just disobeying an order to observe only. She was going to end whatever was left of her military career with a single shot. And there was no version of this where she walked away without a court-martial. Her radio crackled. Back at command, someone she didn't recognize. All units in sector, this is Kestrel Command. Maintain radio silence. Operation in sector is politically sensitive. No engagement. Repeat, no engagement. Any unauthorized action will be prosecuted under UCMJ. She set the radio down beside her. She looked through the scope. She found the first target, the flanking element commander, identifiable by his position and his communication behavior, the one the others were watching for signals. He was moving. She had maybe 4 seconds before he reached new cover. Her finger rested against the trigger guard, not on the trigger, against the guard. The way she'd been trained, the last moment of choice before the moment of action. She thought about her career. She thought about the court-martial. She thought about the disciplinary report already sitting on Colonel Hartwick's desk with her name on it in ink that was barely dry. Then she thought about 12 men moving toward a choke point they didn't know was a trap. She moved her finger to the trigger. "Forgive me," she said, to no one in particular, or maybe to everyone, and she fired. The shot cracked through the cold air, and the flanking element commander went down. And for 1 full second, the entire operation froze. Enemy and friendly alike, every person in that 6-block radius suddenly stopped by the sound of a rifle shot from a direction no one had expected. In the sudden halt, Reyes heard it, felt the pause in enemy movement, and he knew, with the instinct of a man who has spent 15 years reading the rhythm of firefights, that something had just changed. "What was that?" Torres said. "Friendly," Reyes said. He didn't know how he knew. He just knew. And Sarah Vance, on her rooftop 6 blocks away, was already working the bolt. She had 12 men to save and 90 seconds to do it in, and she had already used 4 of them. She found her second target. She fired. The second shot barely had time to echo before Sarah was already moving through the scope to find her third target. Her breathing was controlled, not calm, controlled, which is a different thing entirely. Calm is what you feel when nothing is at stake. Controlled is what you manufacture when everything is. 0 minutes, 4 seconds gone. The enemy element on the northeast side had gone momentarily still after the first 2 shots, the way a school of fish freezes when something large moves through the water. That stillness would last maybe 5 seconds before their training kicked in and they started identifying her position. Sarah knew this. She had been counting on it. She found target 3, a man moving low along the wall of a building, trying to reach a corner that would give him a sight line on Alpha 6's northeast push. He was good. He was fast. He was almost to the corner when she fired. 0, 11 seconds. In the alley 6 blocks south, Reyes heard the 3rd shot and understood something he hadn't understood before. Whoever was on that rooftop wasn't reacting. They were executing a plan. The shots were too deliberate, too sequenced, too geometrically precise to be opportunistic. Someone had looked at this situation and done the math before pulling the trigger even once. "Keep moving," he said. "Northeast. Don't stop." "Who is shooting?" Torres demanded from the front, not breaking stride. "Don't know. Doesn't matter. They're on our side." "How do you know they're on our side?" "Because we're still alive." Torres processed this for exactly 1 second and then kept moving, which was the right answer. Webb appeared at Reyes's left shoulder, pressing a folded piece of field dressing against the side of his own head without breaking stride, blood already soaking through the olive drab. "You know," he said, breathing hard, "for a Christmas Eve, this is really something. Save it. I'm just saying, most people are opening presents right now. Marcus. Moving. I'm moving." 0:19 seconds. Sarah fired her 4th shot and felt the familiar mechanical certainty of the rifle doing what it was designed to do. And then she was already tracking left because she had seen something through the scope that changed her timeline. There was a position she hadn't accounted for. A 2-man team on a 2nd-floor window 2 blocks east of Alpha 6's route, and they were setting up a machine gun. Not a rifle, a belt-fed machine gun, and if that thing opened up on a team moving through a narrow alley, no amount of discipline or training or individual courage would matter. The physics were simply against them. She pivoted. The machine gun was the priority now. Everything else could wait. She found the man feeding the belt. He was focused on his partner, on the weapon, on the setup, the particular tunnel vision of a man trying to get equipment operational under pressure. He wasn't watching the roof lines. She fired. 0:26 seconds. The machine gun went silent before it ever fired a round, and the second man in that window made a decision in about half a second. He looked at his partner, looked at the direction the shot had come from, and went flat. Smart. He was still alive because he was smart, but the machine gun was off the board, and that was what mattered. Back at the command center, a young signals officer named Corporal Dean Pritchard had been watching the radio intercepts on his screen for the past 6 minutes with growing unease. Pritchard was 24 years old, 8 months into his first deployment, and he had joined the Army because his father had served and his grandfather before that, and he believed in the institution the way young people believe in institutions before institutions give them a reason not to. He had been in the room when Colonel Hartwick had cut the transmission. He had seen it happen. He had watched Hartwick's hand come down on that console, and he had stood there and said nothing, because Hartwick was a colonel and he was a corporal, and that was how the chain of command worked. But now he was looking at his intercept screen, and the intercepts were telling him something that his training said he needed to report, and his gut said he needed to report, and the only thing standing in the way of him reporting it was the image of Hartwick's hand coming down on that console. He turned to the senior NCO at the adjacent station. "Sergeant Elroy." Staff Sergeant Cynthia Elroy didn't look up from her own screen. "What?" "I've got intercepts showing an active sniper engaging the encirclement around Alpha 6's last known position." Now she looked up. "Friendly?" "Unidentified, but the target pattern is consistent with the shots are hitting the encirclement elements, not Alpha 6. Elroy stared at him for a moment. Then she looked at Hartwick's closed office door across the room. Then she looked back at Pritchard. "Log it," she said. "Should I report it to—" "Log it, Corporal." Her voice was steady. "Just log it." Pritchard looked at his screen, at the intercepts, at the pattern of shots that told a very clear story about what was happening in the Haroun district right now. "Yes, Sergeant," he said, and began typing, and made sure his timestamp was exact, because some part of him that was younger than his training and older than his fear understood that timestamps mattered, that records mattered, that someday someone might want to know exactly what happened and exactly when and exactly who was in that room. 0:38 seconds. Sarah fired her sixth shot, and for the first time her hand was not entirely steady. Not much. A tremor so small that anyone watching her from 10 feet away would never have seen it. But she felt it, and she knew what it meant. It wasn't fear. It was the body's honest response to sustained, extreme focus, the neurological cost of operating at the outer edge of your ability for longer than your system was designed to maintain it. She had been running on adrenaline and training, and the particular fierce clarity that comes from committing to something you cannot take back. And that clarity had a cost. She breathed. She found target 7. She fired. 0:44 seconds. Alpha 6 had covered 2 of the 6 blocks, and Reyes could feel the geometry changing. The pressure from the south had eased. Whoever was on that rooftop had taken something apart back there, some key element of the encirclement, because the fire coming from that direction had dropped from sustained to sporadic. The east had gone quiet entirely. The north was still active, but the fighters there were not pressing forward the way they had been. They were hesitating. And in a well-coordinated ambush, hesitation was the first sign that the coordination was breaking down. "They're losing their nerve," Torres called back from point. "Don't count on it," Reyes said. "Keep the pace. Ramirez is slowing down. Galvin, on Ramirez." "Already on him," Galvin said, and he was, one hand on Ramirez's arm, matching his irregular stride, keeping him upright and moving through what Reyes knew was more willpower than physical capability at this point. Petty Officer First Class Danny Ramirez had taken a round through the left thigh 20 minutes ago, and the fact that he was still ambulatory was a testament to either extraordinary pain tolerance or extraordinary stubbornness. And with Danny Ramirez, those two things had always been basically the same. "Talk to me, Danny," Galvan said, not gently, because gentle wasn't what Ramirez needed right now. "I'm fine," Ramirez said. "You're not fine." "I know, but I'm moving." "Yeah, you are." Galvin's grip tightened. "Keep going." 0:52 seconds. The 8th shot was the hardest. The target was moving fast. Someone in the north element had figured out, at least partially, where the shots were coming from, and they had sent a runner to try and change the approach angle. The runner was cutting between 2 buildings in a broken, unpredictable pattern, the kind of movement designed specifically to make a sniper's job difficult. Sarah tracked him for 3 full seconds, which was 3 seconds she didn't have. And then she made a judgment call about trajectory and timing and fired, and the runner went down. She was breathing harder now. 0:59 seconds. "I count at least 8 down," Torres said from the front. 8, 1 shooter. "Focus," Reyes said. "I'm just saying, whoever that is, focus, Torres." In the command center, Hartwick's door opened. He came out with a coffee mug in his hand and looked at the room with the expression of a man checking on a routine operation. He looked at Elroy. "Status." Elroy kept her eyes on her screen. "Alpha 6 is moving, sir. Northeast. They appear to be making progress toward an extraction point. I ordered them to hold position." "Yes, sir." "They're moving." "Yes, sir. They appear to have— There's an unidentified sniper element providing support." The coffee mug stopped halfway to Hartwick's mouth. "An unidentified—" He set the mug down on the nearest surface. "What sniper element? There is no sniper element authorized in that sector." "No, sir, there isn't." Elroy met his eyes for exactly 1 moment before looking back at her screen. Hartwick turned to Pritchard. "Where is this shooter?" Pritchard had been waiting for this question and had also been quietly dreading it. And now that it arrived, he heard his own voice come out steadier than he expected. "We haven't been able to pinpoint the exact position, sir. The shots are coming from the north of the district. Rooftop, most likely. Get me a name. Get me an identification. I want to know who authorized a shooter in that sector right now." "Yes, sir." Pritchard turned to his screen and typed something. And then he made a decision so small it would have been invisible to anyone watching. He typed a little slower than he was capable of typing. Just a little. Enough that the answer Hartwick wanted would take a few extra minutes to arrive. It was not insubordination. It was not disobedience. It was a 24-year-old kid from Ohio buying a few extra seconds for 12 men to stay alive. And it was the bravest thing he had done in his life up to that point. 1 minute and 9 seconds. Sarah fired her 10th shot and heard, for the first time, the sound she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. A change in the quality of the enemy gunfire in the alley grid below her. It was thinning. Not stopped, not over, but thinning in the specific way that fire thins when the men producing it are no longer coordinated, when they are reacting individually instead of collectively, when the architecture of a plan has started coming apart and each man is now making his own calculations about risk. She had broken the ambush's spine. "Alpha 6, she said quietly into her radio, knowing she wasn't supposed to be on this channel, knowing there would be a record of this transmission, knowing it didn't matter anymore. "This is Vance. Northeast route is open. You have maybe 3 minutes before they reorganize. Move." The radio crackled, and then she heard the voice she recognized from the distress calls that had pulled her out of her quarters 3 hours ago. Reyes, steady, tired, alive. "Vance," a pause. "Are you the one who's been putting them down?" "Move, Master Chief. You can thank me later." "Roger that." Another pause, and she could hear in the background the sound of men moving, boots on ground, controlled, urgent movement. "Sarah, are you clear?" "I'm fine." "You don't sound fine." "I said I'm fine. Get your men out." She heard Webb in the background say something, and Reyes say something back, and then the radio was quiet, and she was alone on her rooftop, with an empty shell casing beside her knee, and her hands shaking in a way she was no longer trying to suppress. 1:21 seconds. Back in the alley grid, Torres reached the corner that opened onto the northeast extraction corridor and stopped, checking both directions the way he'd been trained to, expecting resistance, expecting fire, expecting something. What he found was an empty street, not empty the way abandoned streets are empty. Empty the way a path is empty when someone has already cleared it for you. He looked back at Reyes. Reyes looked at the street. "She did it," Torres said. Reyes didn't answer. He moved past Torres to the front of the formation because he was the ranking man, and the ranking man goes first, and those are the rules you live by, even when everything else falls apart. He checked the street himself, looked at the angles, felt the quality of the silence. "Move," he said. They moved. Galvan and Ramirez came through the corner together. Ramirez's jaw set in a hard line that was doing a lot of the work his leg wasn't capable of doing right now. Webb came last, covering the rear, moving backward for 10 steps before turning, and then they were all through and moving northeast, and the sound of the firefight behind them was already thinning, already becoming something that was happening to someone else, somewhere else. And Reyes felt for the first time in the past 40 minutes something that wasn't adrenaline, something quieter and more complicated, something that felt uncomfortably like grief mixed with relief. And he wasn't sure what he was grieving exactly, except that it might have been the version of tonight in which none of this had been necessary. He keyed his radio. "Command, this is Alpha 6. We are moving on the northeast corridor. We have 11 mobile and 1 ambulatory wounded. We need extraction at grid." Alpha 6, this is command. The voice was not Hartwick. It was someone else, younger, with a slightly elevated pitch of someone who has just been given information they wish they hadn't been given. We are coordinating extraction. Stand by. We don't need you to coordinate. We need you to receive us. Copy, Alpha 6. There will be a vehicle extraction at the northeast checkpoint in a pause, the sound of someone checking something or pretending to check something. 12 minutes. 12 minutes, Webb said.
Can Ramirez do 12 minutes?
Reyes asked Galvin. He'll do it. You didn't ask me, Ramirez said. I'm asking Galvin. I'm right here. I know where you are, Danny. Keep moving. In the command center, Hartwick was on a different radio now. A secure line, a direct line, the kind that bypassed standard protocols and went to people whose names didn't appear in the organizational charts that got filed with oversight committees. He was speaking quietly, standing slightly turned away from the room, and Pritchard, who had very good hearing, caught the shape of what was being said without catching all the words. He caught unauthorized action and identified and career and before this gets to a report, he caught very clearly the phrase, make sure it ends with her. Pritchard's fingers stopped on his keyboard. He looked at Elroy. Elroy was looking at her screen with a careful, neutral expression of someone who was also listening and had also made a decision about what to do with what she heard. She caught Pritchard's look from the corner of her eye. She gave the smallest possible shake of her head. Not a no, more of a not yet. Pritchard looked back at his screen. He started typing again, and this time he was typing a record. A detailed, time-stamped, precisely worded record of everything that had happened in this room tonight, and he was typing it to a personal log on a device that was not connected to the command center's network. And he was doing it in the full understanding that what he was creating was evidence, and that evidence was the only thing in the world that could not be taken back once it existed. The timestamp read 0412 hours, December 24th. Alpha 6 reached the northeast checkpoint at 0424 hours, 12 minutes later, exactly as promised and not 1 second sooner. They came out of the alleyway into the wider street and found 2 armored vehicles with their engines running, and 4 men who had the look of people who had been told to pick up a package and not ask questions about it. The vehicles had no markings. The men had no unit patches, which told Reyes everything he needed to know about how this extraction was being handled and what official record it would appear on. Ramirez was loaded into the first vehicle. Galvan got in beside him, hand already on Ramirez's arm, monitoring. The rest of Alpha 6 loaded in 2 minutes flat. Reyes was the last one in. Before he pulled the doors shut, he looked back at the district they just walked out of, at the skyline in the pre-dawn dark. He tried to identify which rooftop. Couldn't. The distances were too great, and the light was too low, and there were too many buildings. Vance, he said into his radio one last time. Static. Vance, do you copy? Static. He got in the vehicle and pulled the door shut, and they moved. Sarah Vance had already packed up her rifle. She was moving off the rooftop by the time Alpha 6 loaded into the vehicles, because she was a professional, and professionals don't linger on a position after a mission, regardless of whether the mission was authorized, regardless of whether there was anyone left to observe her, regardless of anything except the basic instinct of a trained soldier who knows that staying still in a dangerous place is its own kind of death wish. She went down the stairwell of the building with her rifle case over her shoulder, and her hands steady now, the tremor gone, the adrenaline finally metabolizing into something cooler and quieter. She felt tired. She felt something else too, something she didn't have a word for yet. Not satisfaction, not relief, not pride. Something more complicated. The particular emotional aftermath of doing something that was absolutely right and absolutely going to cost you everything. She came out at street level and started moving south. She had maybe 3 hours before Hartwick had her name. She had maybe 4 before he had her in a room. She thought about calling someone, a lawyer, a friend, someone from her unit who might know what to do when a soldier on restricted duty ignored a direct order, left her base, infiltrated a combat zone, and engaged the enemy without authorization. Even if that engagement had resulted in the survival of 12 men who were otherwise going to die in an alley while their command watched. She thought about calling, and she kept walking, because there was no one to call. Not yet. Not at 04:27 hours on Christmas Eve. Not until the sun came up, and the world had time to figure out what had happened tonight. And she had time to figure out what she was going to say when someone put her in a room and asked her to explain herself. What would she say? She turned the question over as she walked. She tried on different versions of it. She thought about what a lawyer would advise. Minimize exposure. Don't volunteer information. Let the record speak. She thought about what her father would have said. Her father, who had been an infantry sergeant for 22 years and had told her once, only once, that the thing about being a soldier was that the uniform came with 2 sets of orders. The written ones and the ones that came from the part of you that knew the difference between right and wrong. He'd said you had to know which set to follow when they conflicted. He hadn't told her how to live with the choice after you made it. She figured she was about to find out. Her radio crackled. Not command, not Alpha 6. Someone else. A frequency she recognized. A voice she recognized. Flat Midwestern vowels she would know anywhere. Vance, it's Elroy. She stopped walking. Elroy. I know where you've been tonight. I know what you did. A pause. There are people in this building right now making sure that what you did tonight gets written the way they want it written.
You understand what I'm telling you?
I understand. I also want you to know that I have been keeping a record of my own since approximately 2,347 hours tonight. A very detailed record. Another pause, carefully chosen. I am not the only one. Sarah stood in the dark street and breathed. Elroy, get back to base, Vance. Get a lawyer. Get there before they come looking for you. The radio clicked off. Sarah stood there for 3 more seconds. Then she started moving again, faster now, her boots hitting the road with a purpose that was different from the purpose she'd started with tonight. She had walked out of her quarters a few hours ago with nothing but a rifle and a decision. She was walking back with something she hadn't expected to carry home. Witnesses. Sarah made it back to base at 05:01 hours. She didn't go through the main gate. She went through the maintenance access on the east side, the one with the broken camera that had been broken for 6 weeks and was still waiting on a parts requisition. And she moved through the service corridor with her rifle case against her back and her boots quiet on the concrete and her mind running through every variable she could think of, cataloging them, ordering them, the way her brain had been trained to process a field situation. Except this time, the field situation was her own life. She reached her quarters. She sat on the edge of her bunk. She set the rifle case on the floor and put her hands on her knees and looked at them. They were steady now, completely steady. Whatever her body had needed to process tonight, it had processed it somewhere between the rooftop and the maintenance corridor. And what was left was the particular clarity that comes after you've crossed a line, and there's no point in pretending the line still exists. She picked up her personal phone. 05:03 hours. She scrolled to a number she had hoped not to need and pressed call. It rang 4 times. Then, whoever this is, it's 5 in the morning. Captain Delaney, it's Vance. A pause. Then the sound of someone sitting up. Captain Patricia Delaney was a JAG officer, Judge Advocate General, the Army's legal corps, and she and Sarah had met at a leadership seminar 14 months ago and stayed in contact the way people do when they recognize something in each other that they don't find often. Delaney was precise and fast and had a mind like a trap. And more importantly, she had a reputation for taking cases that made the people in the comfortable rooms very uncomfortable. Vance, Delaney's voice was already sharpening. What did you do? Something I do again. That's not what I asked. I know. Sarah looked at her hands. I need a lawyer, Patricia, and I need you to understand that I am not going to apologize for what I did. A long pause, the sound of a lamp clicking on somewhere. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. Sarah told her. She told her all of it. The distress call, the restricted duty order, the rooftop, the shots, Elroy's radio call. She spoke in the flat, factual cadence of an after-action report because that was the language she trusted when emotion was trying to get in the way of precision. She did not editorialize. She did not explain herself. She simply told what happened in the order it happened. When she finished, Delaney was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "You fired 10 shots in 90 seconds without authorization in an active combat zone while on restricted duty and in direct violation of a standing order from a colonel." Yes. And those 10 shots saved the lives of 12 Navy SEALs. Yes. Another pause. Okay. And something in Delaney's voice had shifted. Not softer, but deeper, more settled. The sound of someone who has just decided where they stand. Don't go anywhere. Don't talk to anyone from command without me present. Don't sign anything. Don't say a single word to Hartwick or anyone on his staff. Can you do that? Yes. I'll be there in 40 minutes. 0541 hours. Alpha 6 arrived at FOB Kestrel in the unmarked vehicles and unloaded into the medical bay with the particular control disorder of a team that is holding itself together through training alone. Ramirez went straight to surgery. The others went through triage, lacerations, a fractured wrist on Torres from a fall, 2 cases of significant blood loss that needed fluid replacement. Webb got 7 stitches above his ear from a medic who kept making small sounds of sympathy that Webb actively discouraged. "Stop doing that," Webb told her. "You have a significant laceration." "I'm aware. It must have hurt. Doc, I appreciate the concern. Please just stitch it." Reyes stood apart from the triage activity, which was unusual enough that Torres noticed. Torres noticed most things. It was his particular professional gift, the capacity for peripheral observation that had saved their lives on point more times than any of them had counted. He walked over to where Reyes was standing against the wall, with his arms crossed and his eyes somewhere else. "Master Chief," Reyes looked at him. "You good?" "I'm standing here, aren't I?" "That's not what I asked." Reyes was quiet for a moment. He looked across the room at Galvan, who was leaning against a wall with his eyes closed and his head tilted back, still in his gear, not injured, just exhausted in the specific total way that medics get exhausted when they've been keeping someone alive through willpower and improvisation for the better part of an hour. He looked at Webb in the chair getting stitched. He looked at the doorway that Ramirez had gone through. "They left us," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even anger, exactly. It was just a statement of fact that he needed to say out loud because it had been living in his chest since the moment Hartwick's voice had come through that radio, and he needed it to be a word in the air rather than a weight in his body. Torres was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "they did. They calculated it. Somebody sat in a room and decided that 12 of us dying was acceptable collateral damage for whatever diplomatic situation they were managing. They ran the numbers. We came up short. And then somebody else ran different numbers," Torres said. Reyes looked at him. "Vance ran different numbers," Torres said. "She ran her own numbers, and we came up long enough to matter." Reyes uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor. Then he looked back up at Torres, and Torres, who had served with Reyes for 6 years and knew every version of his face, saw something in it that he'd never quite seen before. Not in the way Reyes normally processed a bad op, not the usual grim, efficient closure of a man putting a difficult mission in its mental file and moving on. This was different. This was a man recalibrating something foundational. "We need to find out what's happening to her," Reyes said, already thinking the same thing. She's on restricted duty. She was on restricted duty when she did this. Whatever they're going to do to her, we're going to be in the room, Torres said. Reyes looked at him. All 12 of us, Torres said, or however many of us can stand up straight. We'll get Ramirez out of surgery if we have to. You can't get a man out of surgery. I've done stupider things tonight. For the first time in what felt like a very long time, something that was almost a smile moved across Reyes's face. Then it went, and what replaced it was harder and more serious and more purposeful than anything that had been there before. Get the guys together, whoever can move. We need to talk. 0608 hours. In Hartwick's office, the conversation happening was a different kind of altogether. Hartwick was not alone. He had two people with him. A man in civilian clothes whose name Pritchard had not been able to catch when he arrived 40 minutes ago, and Major Clifford Stills, Hartwick's executive officer, who had the specific, rigid posture of someone being asked to stand behind a decision he doesn't entirely believe in. Pritchard could see them through the glass partition that separated Hartwick's office from the main operations room. Not clearly, not enough to lip read, but enough to see the body language. Hartwick at his desk, civilian standing, Stills by the door, arms at his sides, jaw set. Elroy appeared at Pritchard's station. She didn't sit down. She leaned against the edge of his desk and looked at the glass partition. How long have they been in there? 38 minutes. Who's the civilian? No idea. He came in through the south entrance. No sign-in. No sign-in, Elroy repeated, as if she were filing that fact in a particular drawer of her mind. Are you still keeping your record? Yes, Sergeant. Good. She was quiet for a moment. Pritchard, what you're doing, the record keeping, you understand that depending on how this goes, it might not be enough. Records can be buried. Records can be reclassified. The people in that room have the authority to make things disappear. I know that. But records can also be copied, Elroy said, very carefully, looking at the glass partition the entire time. And copies can be sent places before anyone has the chance to bury the originals. Pritchard looked at his screen. Then he looked at the small personal device sitting beside his keyboard, the one he'd been typing to all night, the one not connected to the command network. I understand, Sergeant. Good. Elroy pushed off from the edge of his desk. I'm going to get coffee. I'll be back in 10 minutes. She walked away. Pritchard looked at his personal device. He picked it up. He opened the encrypted messaging application he downloaded 6 months ago for reasons that had been entirely personal and were now proving to be something else entirely. He found the address he needed, a journalist he'd met at a base function, a woman who covered military affairs for a publication that had the kind of reputation that made the people in the comfortable rooms nervous. He had her contact because she'd given everyone her card, and he'd kept it in his wallet for no reason he could have articulated at the time. He could articulate the reason now. He looked at the glass partition, at Hartwick, at the civilian. He started typing. 0619 hours. Captain Delaney arrived at Sarah's quarters in 39 minutes, which meant she'd driven faster than she should have, and she came in with her hair not entirely brushed and her uniform jacket not entirely buttoned, and a legal pad and a recorder, and the expression of someone who has been awake for hours already, even though she technically hadn't. She looked at Sarah sitting on the edge of her bunk. She looked at the rifle case on the floor. She looked at the window going slowly gray with pre-dawn light. You look terrible, she said. Thank you. I mean it in a clinical sense. Have you slept? No. Eaten? No. Okay, eat something while we talk. I need you sharp. She pulled the chair from Sarah's desk, sat down, clicked on the recorder, set it on the desk. Here's where we are. You have committed, technically, approximately 4 to 6 separate UCMJ violations, depending on how creative they want to be with the charging. Disobeying a direct order is the big one. Going AWOL from restricted duty, unauthorized discharge of a weapon in a combat zone, potentially negligent discharge, though they'd have a hard time making that one stick given that every shot hit a legitimate enemy combatant. I know what I did. I know you know. I'm telling you what they're going to say you did. Delaney tapped her legal pad. Here's also where we are on the other side. You have the outcome, 12 men alive. You have the evidence of the shots, 10 shots, 10 targets, no civilian casualties, 0 friendly fire. You have the radio record of Hartwick's stand-down order, and you have, she paused, looking at Sarah steadily, apparently at least 2 witnesses inside command who have been keeping records. Elroy and Pritchard. I don't know those names yet, but I'm going to. Delaney sat forward. Sarah, I need you to hear me very clearly right now. Whatever Hartwick is building in that room at command, and I promise you he is building something, because men like Hartwick always build something when they feel exposed. It is going to be aimed at you. It is going to be aimed at making what you did look like the problem, and making what he did look like protocol. He is going to call you insubordinate and reckless, and a soldier with a documented history of failing to follow orders. And he is going to point to your disciplinary file as evidence that this is a pattern. It's not a pattern. The previous incident, I know about the previous incident. I've already read your file. Delaney held up one hand. I'm not saying it is a pattern. I'm saying that's what he's going to say, and we need to be ready for it. She lowered her hand. Our argument is simple. His order was unlawful. An order that directs soldiers to remain passive while they are being killed, when there is a means available to prevent those deaths, is not a lawful order. It is not a lawful order because it violates the foundational duty of command, which is the preservation of the lives of those under your authority. She said it the way she probably said things in a courtroom. Not fast, not decorated, just clean and direct, and with the particular weight of someone who has thought this through to the end and found it solid. We're not just defending you, we're prosecuting him. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sky was getting lighter. Somewhere on the base, there was the sound of reveille being played. He has more power than I do, Sarah said. He has more rank than you do, Delaney said. That's not the same thing. Not in a courtroom. 0641 hours. Hartwick came out of his office at 0641 hours, and the first thing he did was look at the operations room like he was taking inventory. And the second thing he did was look at Pritchard's station. Pritchard was at his station, back straight, face neutral, eyes on his screen. His personal device was in his pocket. Hartwick crossed the room. He stopped beside Pritchard's station. Corporal. Sir, where are we on the identification of the unauthorized shooter? Still working on it, sir. The signal data is being cross-referenced with base access logs. Hartwick looked at him for a moment too long. The kind of look that was designed to make you feel that whatever you were hiding, he already knew about it. And the look itself was its own kind of accusation. Pritchard had known men like Hartwick his entire life. Coaches, teachers, the particular species of authority figure who used the impression of omniscience as a management tool. He had always found that look uncomfortable. He found it less uncomfortable now than he would have yesterday because he had done something tonight that made him feel, for the first time, like the kind of person who didn't need to be afraid of a look. Let me know the moment you have a name, Hartwick said. Yes, sir. Hartwick walked away. Elroy appeared at Pritchard's side, coffee mug in hand, looking at her own screen. He'll have the name in an hour, whether you give it to him or not, she said quietly. The access logs will surface it. I know. So the time you bought matters, but it's almost spent. I know that too. Pritchard glanced at his pocket, at the outline of the device through the fabric, but I already used it. Elroy looked at her coffee mug. Something moved across her face that was too careful and controlled to call a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. Good, she said, and walked back to her station. 0702 hours. The 9 members of Alpha 6 who could stand were gathered in the back room of the medical bay, which was not a room designed for gatherings. It was a supply room, with metal shelving along the walls and a floor that smelled like antiseptic, and a single overhead light that made everyone look slightly worse than they were. Webb had a bandage on his head. Torres had his fractured wrist in a soft wrap. 2 other men were carrying themselves with the particular careful motion of people with taped ribs. Galvan was the only one who looked physically intact, which was appropriate since he'd spent the entire operation keeping everyone else intact at the expense of himself. Reyes stood at the front. "I'm going to say this once," he said, "and I need each of you to hear it and tell me honestly if you disagree with anything I'm about to say." He looked around the room, 9 faces looking back. "Last night, Command left us to die. That is not a characterization. That is what happened. Colonel Hartwick was informed of our situation, had the resources to support us, and made an active decision to withhold that support. He cut our communications. He stood down QRF. He redirected our extraction. And then he told us to hold in place." Nobody spoke. A soldier who had no authorization to be where she was, who was on restricted duty, who risked her entire career and her freedom to come to a rooftop 6 blocks from where we were dying. She is the reason we are standing in this room right now. He paused. Her name is Specialist Sarah Vance, and right now, Hartwick is building a case to court-martial her for saving our lives. The silence in that supply room was a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of men who have nothing to say. The silence of men who have too much to say and are trying to decide which part of it to let out first. It was Webb who spoke, which surprised no one because it was always Webb. "So what are we doing about it?" "We are going to request a formal debrief," Reyes said. "All 9 of us, together. We are going to sit in front of whoever convenes that debrief, and we are going to tell exactly what happened last night, in detail, in sequence, and on record. We are going to make sure that the record of what Hartwick did exists in our testimony before his version of events has time to harden into the official story." "Will they listen?" Galvan asked. "They'll have to listen. 9 SEALs requesting a formal after-action debrief is not something you can quietly put in a drawer." "Hartwick will try," Torres said. "Let him try." Reyes looked at Torres steadily. "Here's the thing about a man who is willing to sacrifice 12 soldiers for political convenience. He's been doing it because he believes no one will push back. He believes the system protects him because he is the system." He paused. "He has not yet had to deal with the situation where the 12 soldiers he tried to sacrifice are alive and talking. That changes the math." Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd committed to a point. "When do we move?" "Now, before they have time to write the narrative." Reyes looked at each of them in turn. "Are we agreed?" 9 hands went up. Not salutes, just hands. Simple, direct, unanimous. "Then let's go," Reyes said. 7:14 hours. Sarah's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she thought about what Elroy had said. Witnesses. And she picked up. "Vance." Not a question, a statement. "Who is this?" "My name is not important right now. What's important is that I'm a journalist, and I have received documentation regarding the events in the Haroun district last night, and I would like to speak with you before the military's version of those events becomes the only version." Sarah stared at the wall across from her bunk. She looked at Delaney, who was watching her with the sharp, focused attention of a lawyer reading a room. "Who gave you documentation?" Sarah said. "Someone who was in the room when decisions were made. Someone who kept a record. The documentation is detailed and time-stamped, and it tells a very specific story about what Colonel Hartwick ordered and when he ordered it, and what the known consequences of those orders were when he gave them." Sarah held the phone against her ear and felt the weight of it. Not the physical weight, but the other kind. The weight of a moment that is pivoting. She put the phone on speaker so Delaney could hear.
I'm going to hand the phone to my lawyer now,
Sarah said, and she's going to ask you some questions. And depending on your answers, we'll decide how to proceed. A pause. Then, that's exactly what I do in your position. Delaney leaned forward. She picked up her legal pad. She clicked her pen. Start talking, she said. Outside, the sun was fully up now. Christmas morning, gray and cold and utterly indifferent to the specific human drama unfolding in its first light. Across the base, people were waking up, and some of them were calling home, and some of them were thinking about being somewhere else, and none of them knew yet what had happened in the Haroun district 8 hours ago. None of them knew that a colonel had pressed his hand to a console and silenced 12 men. None of them knew that a woman on restricted duty had climbed to a rooftop alone and fired 10 shots in 90 seconds. None of them knew that a 24-year-old corporal from Ohio had spent the darkest part of the night typing a record of the truth onto a device in his pocket. But the day was young, and Hartwick, sitting in his office, pouring his second cup of coffee, was about to discover that the thing about burying a story is that the story has to stay buried. And sometimes the people who know the story are not the kind of people who stay quiet. And sometimes the 12 men you left to die in an alley walk back through the door with their hands up and their voices ready. And they are not asking for permission anymore. They are telling you what happened. And they are daring you to say otherwise. The debrief request from Alpha 6 landed on Major Clifford Still's desk at 0731 hours, and he sat there looking at it for a full minute before he did anything else. Stills was not a complicated man, and he had never wanted to be. He had spent 21 years in the Army doing things the right way, following procedure, respecting the chain, filing the paperwork on time, and going home at the end of the day with the clean conscience of someone who had colored inside every line. He had served under 6 different commanding officers. Some of them had been brilliant. Some had been mediocre. One had been quietly corrupt in the small, penny-ante way that the military occasionally produced. Padding expenses, steering contracts, nothing that made headlines. Stills had managed all of them with the same steady professionalism, and he had never once been asked to do something that genuinely kept him up at night. Until last night. He looked at the debrief request. 9 signatures. Master Chief Daniel Reyes at the top, 8 names below in clean block letters. Formal request for a recorded after-action debrief, submitted through proper channels. Impossible to misplace or misroute without someone visibly misplacing or misrouting it. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. Across the base, Hartwick was drinking his second cup of coffee and waiting for his aide to bring him a name. The name he'd been waiting for since 0430 hours. The name that was going to be the cornerstone of what he was building. The narrative of an unauthorized, insubordinate soldier with a documented disciplinary history who had violated standing orders and put the entire operation at risk. He had the structure of it in his head already. He had the language. He knew how to write an official account the way a sculptor knows how to find the figure inside a block of stone. You just remove everything that doesn't serve the shape you want. His aide knocked, came in. Sir, we have the identification. Hartwick set down his coffee. Tell me. Specialist Sarah Vance. She's currently assigned to this post, on restricted duty pending disciplinary review. The access log shows she exited through the east maintenance access at approximately 2,203 hours and returned at 0501. The camera at that access point has been non-operational for 6 weeks, so there's no visual record, but the electronic log captured her access card both times. Hartwick absorbed this without expression. What's she on restricted duty for? Previous incident, sir, 7 months ago. She disobeyed a direct order during a training exercise, refused to fire on a target that she assessed as a civilian risk despite the range officer's clearance. The assessment turned out to be correct. There was an unauthorized person in the range area, but she was still cited for insubordination. So she has a pattern. That's one way to characterize it, sir.
Hartwick looked at his aide steadily.
That is the only way to characterize it. He picked up his pen. I want a charge sheet prepared. UCMJ violations. Going AWOL from restricted duty, disobeying a direct order, unauthorized discharge of a weapon in an active combat zone. Get JAG to draw it up. Yes, sir. The aide didn't move immediately, which was unusual. Sir, there's also a debrief request from Alpha 6. The pen stopped.
9 signatures,
The aide continued, voice carefully neutral. Master Chief Reyes and 8 of his men. They're requesting a formal, recorded after-action debrief. It came through proper channels, sir. It's been logged. Hartwick was quiet for a moment. When did this come in? 0731, sir. He set the pen down. He looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating. Then he looked back at his aide. Get me Stills. 0743 hours. Stills came into Hartwick's office and closed the door behind him. And the first thing he noticed was that Hartwick was standing rather than sitting, which Hartwick only did when he was managing something he didn't want to show on his face. The debrief request, Hartwick said, from Alpha 6. Yes, sir, I was just reviewing it. I want it handled internally, quietly, a standard post-mission debrief, informal record, standard routing. Stills looked at him. Sir, the request specifically asks for a formal recorded debrief. They've cited the relevant regulation. If we reroute it to an informal process, they can appeal, and the appeal itself becomes a record that, I am aware of the procedural implications, Major. Then you're aware that 9 combat veterans requesting a formal, recorded debrief is not something we can informally redirect without creating exactly the kind of paper trail you— Stills stopped himself, chose his next words with the care of a man walking on uncertain ground. Without creating complications. Hartwick looked at him. The look was the same one he'd used on Pritchard earlier, the impression of omniscience, the implication that resistance was not only futile, but already anticipated. Your concern is noted, Major. Sir, Stills clasped his hands behind his back. He had rehearsed nothing. He had prepared nothing. What came out next came from somewhere he hadn't consciously accessed before, or maybe had been accessing slowly over the past 7 hours without realizing it. With respect, what happened last night, I was in this building when it happened. I watched you stand down QRF. I heard the transmission with Master Chief Reyes. I know what was said on that radio. He paused. I need you to know that I will not sign any document that misrepresents those events. The office was very quiet. That is a significant statement, Major. Yes, sir, it is. Hartwick looked at him for a long moment with an expression that had moved past the impression of omniscience into something colder and more honest. You're choosing your side. I'm choosing not to have a side, Stills said. I'm choosing the record. Sir, he left the office without being dismissed, which he had never done in 21 years, and the feeling of doing it was stranger than he expected. Not triumphant, not terrifying, just solid. Like finding out that the floor you've been standing on is actually load-bearing. 8:01 hours. Delaney had been on the phone for 22 consecutive minutes and had filled 4 pages of her legal pad by the time she clicked off and looked at Sarah. Okay, she said, here's where we are. Sarah had eaten half a granola bar and drunk 2 cups of coffee and was sitting on her bunk with her back against the wall, legs crossed, watching Delaney work with the focused attention of someone who has accepted that their fate is partly in someone else's hands and has chosen to trust those hands. The journalist's name is Helen Marsh. She writes for the Federal Military Review. It's not a tabloid. It's a serious publication, the kind that the Senate Armed Services Committee actually reads. She has Pritchard's documentation, which includes the time-stamped radio transcripts, the command center logs, and a written account of Hartwick's actions from approximately 23:30 last night through 0600 this morning. Delaney tapped her pad. That documentation is already in her hands, which means it's already outside the military's control to suppress. She has not yet published. She is, as of 30 minutes ago, in contact with her editor deciding how to proceed.
What did you tell her?
I told her that my client is willing to speak on record, subject to legal review of any statement before publication, and that we would cooperate fully with her investigation, provided she agrees to give us 48 hours notice before any publication so that we can prepare for the command's response. Delaney looked at her. She agreed. And Hartwick? Hartwick doesn't know about Marsh yet. He will, probably within a few hours, either because someone tells him or because Marsh makes contact with command for comment. When he finds out, Delaney paused, choosing precision over drama. The ground shifts. Right now, he's building a prosecution. When he finds out that a journalist has primary documentation from inside his own command center, he's no longer building a prosecution. He's doing damage control. Sarah looked at her. That changes things. It changes everything. Delaney set her pen down. Sarah, what happened this morning? Pritchard sending that documentation, Elroy making that call to you, Stills. She paused. I've had a contact at the base tell me that Stills walked out of Hartwick's office this morning in a way that is being talked about. I don't have details yet, but if Stills is breaking from Hartwick, then Hartwick's wall of institutional protection has a crack in it, and one crack is all a good lawyer needs. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Hartwick is still going to come after me. Yes, he will file the charge sheet. It's probably already being drafted. And then? And then we answer every charge with the truth. We answer disobeying a direct order by establishing that the order was unlawful. We answer going AWOL by establishing that the circumstances constituted a combat emergency. We answer unauthorized discharge with 10 dead enemy combatants and 12 living Navy SEALs who will testify that those shots were the difference between their survival and their deaths. Delaney held her gaze. We don't run from what you did, Sarah. We put it on the table in the brightest light we can find, and we dare them to call it wrong. 08:22 hours. Reyes was in the hallway outside the medical bay when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Then he remembered that the last time someone had acted on that kind of hesitation, 12 men had nearly died in an alley. And he answered, Master Chief Reyes. A woman's voice, crisp and careful. Speaking. My name is Helen Marsh. I'm a journalist with the Federal Military Review. I have documentation regarding the events of last night in the Haroun district, and I'd like to speak with you. Reyes looked at the ceiling, then at his boots, then at the middle distance where decisions live. Who gave you documentation? I'm not able to disclose my sources, Master Chief. What I can tell you is that what I have is substantial, and it is accurate, and it is going to be published. What I don't have yet is the account of the men who were in that alley. You want our story. I want the truth, which I understand is the same thing in this case. Reyes was quiet for a moment. The hallway around him was empty. Through the door behind him, he could hear the sounds of his men. A voice, a cough, someone's chair scraping on the floor. Alive sounds. Sounds that were only happening because of what Sarah Vance had done 6 hours ago. I'll need to consult with my men first, he said. Of course. And I'll need to know that whatever we say goes on record, official record, not paraphrased, not summarized. Our words attributed to us with our names attached. A brief pause. That's exactly what I'm offering. Then give me 2 hours. You have them. 08:47 hours. Hartwick's charge sheet arrived on Jag's desk at 08:47, and the duty officer who received it was a young lieutenant named Forsyth, who read it through twice and then sat for a moment doing the kind of quiet arithmetic that people do when they're trying to figure out if a document is what it looks like or something else disguised as what it looks like. It looked like a standard charge sheet. The violations cited were real violations. The language was precise. But Forsyth had also been on duty when Alpha 6's debrief request came in, and he had been on duty 2 hours before that when the radio chatter from the Haroon district had been threading through the signals net. And he had enough context to understand that what he was holding was not just a legal document. It was a move in something that was still being played. He picked up his phone and called Captain Delaney. She answered on the first ring. "I've been waiting for this call. You know about the charge sheet?" "I knew it was coming. What are the charges?" "UCMJ, Article 90, willful disobedience of a superior officer. Article 86, unauthorized absence. Article 134, conduct prejudicial to good order. 3 counts total." A pause. "Captain, I want you to know that I am logging the time this charge sheet was received and the time of my contact with you. I want there to be a clean record of the timeline." Delaney's voice had the specific quality of a person who has just received confirmation of something they hoped was true. "Lieutenant Forsyth, you are a good man." "I'm a lawyer, ma'am. I believe in clean records." He paused. "Your client has the right to respond to these charges within 72 hours. I would suggest she take the full 72. "She will. Thank you." He hung up. He sat for a moment, then he began typing his own record of the timestamp, the content, and the call he just made, and he filed it in a place that was accessible and not buried, because accessible was how records survived. 0911 hours. The knock on Hartwick's door came at 0911, and his aide opened it to reveal 2 men Hartwick had not summoned and did not want to see. The first was Brigadier General Arthur Lennox, the post commander, a man who had the physical density of someone who had been doing hard things in difficult places for 30 years, and the particular impatient efficiency of someone who did not enjoy having his morning disrupted. The second was a man in a dark suit who had the bearing of a lawyer and the eyes of someone who read documents for a living and found things in them that other people missed. Hartwick stood. "General Lennox." "Sit down, Tom." Lennox came into the office without being invited and took the chair across from Hartwick's desk, which was the chair that Hartwick usually put subordinates in, and the geometry of it was not accidental. The man in the suit closed the door and remained standing. "You know why I'm here. I assume you have questions about last night's operation." "I have questions about a lot of things." Lennox crossed one leg over the other and looked at Hartwick with the expression of a man who has already formed a judgment and is now in the process of confirming it. "I'm going to start with the radio. Tell me about the radio." "The transmission was cut for operational security reasons. The team's communication was compromised, and continuing to broadcast on that frequency created a risk." "Don't." Lennox's voice was flat and quiet and very hard. "I have the signal logs, Tom. I have the exact time, the exact frequency, and the exact duration of every transmission from Alpha 6 last night. I know when they were calling for help. I know when you were on that radio, and I know when the signal stopped." He uncrossed his leg, leaned forward slightly. "I also have a debrief request from 9 men who were in that alley, and I am going to honor that request, and whatever those 9 men say in that debrief is going to be part of the official record. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Hartwick's jaw was very tight. "I made operational decisions under difficult circumstances, decisions that left 12 men to die." Lennox said it the same way you'd state an altitude or a grid coordinate. No heat in it, just geography. "The man in the suit is counsel from the Inspector General's office. He's here because I requested an independent inquiry this morning at 06:45, approximately 2 hours before you filed charges against Specialist Vance." He paused. "That sequencing is going to be important, Tom. The inquiry precedes the charges. That means the charges look like retaliation. And retaliation against a soldier for an act that saved 12 lives is a very particular kind of ugly." The room was very quiet. "What do you want?" Hartwick said. His voice had changed. "Not broken. Men like Hartwick don't break easily. But something had shifted behind his eyes. The small recalibration of someone who has reached the edge of a position they believed was solid and discovered it was not. "I want the truth," Lennox said, "in a debrief, on record, your version, Alpha 6's version, every version. I want the charge sheet against Vance suspended pending the inquiry. And I want you to understand that this office," he gestured, meaning not the room, but the rank, "is no longer in a position to protect decisions that cannot withstand the light." He stood. "We're done for now. Don't go anywhere." Lennox walked out. The man in the suit followed. The door closed. Hartwick sat in his chair for a very long time. 0941 hours. Reyes gathered his 8 men in the same supply room they'd used at 0714. And this time Galvin had managed to find a box of granola bars and a case of water and set them on one of the shelving units, which was as close to hospitality as a supply room could manage. The men looked less raw than they had 2 hours ago. Not better, not rested, but slightly more settled, the way adrenaline settles into something you can function with when it finally stops spiking. "I got a call from a journalist," Reyes said. No preamble. His men didn't need preamble. "Federal Military Review. She has documentation from inside command, radio logs, timestamps, a written account of what Hartwick did last night." The room was quiet. "She wants our story, on record, with our names." He looked around the room. "I told her we needed to decide together." Torres was the first one. "What's her play? What does she get out of it?" "The truth, same thing we get. And if command tries to suppress it, if they put pressure on the publication?" "She said the documentation is already outside their control, meaning it's been backed up somewhere they can't reach it." Reyes looked at him. "Cliff, once something's outside their control, the only play they have is to make the official story better than the real story. And they can't make the official story better than the real story if 9 of us go on record with the real story." Webb, who had been quiet, unusual for Webb, who was rarely quiet, spoke from the far side of the room. "What about Vance?" "She has a lawyer. She's fighting the charges." "What charges? They charged her?" "Charge sheet came through this morning. 3 counts. For saving our lives." Webb said it without any particular inflection, which made it somehow worse than if he'd shouted it. "They charged her for saving our lives." "Yes." "Then I don't need 2 hours to decide," Webb said. "I don't need 2 minutes. She doesn't spend 1 day of her life being punished for what she did last night. Not 1 day, not 1 hour. You tell me where to show up and I'll be there, and I don't care what it costs." One by one, the rest of the room said yes. Some said it in words. Some said it by simply nodding, the way men do when a decision has already been made, and the gesture is just the formality of acknowledging it. Galvin said it quietly. Torres said it crisply. The 2 men with taped ribs said it at the same time, without looking at each other, which made it sound like something they'd rehearsed, which they hadn't. Reyes looked at all of them. "Okay," he said, "then let's do this right. 1004 hours." Sarah's phone rang again. This time, it was a number she recognized, the base operator routing an internal call. She answered. "Specialist Vance." A voice she didn't know, older, measured. "This is Brigadier General Arthur Lennox. I'm the post commander." Sarah sat up straight, which was an automatic response that she noted with a kind of distant irony. The instinct of a soldier, even when the person calling you is potentially part of the system trying to dismantle you. "Sir, I want you to know that I have suspended the charge sheet filed against you this morning, pending an independent inquiry from the Inspector General's office. The charges are not dropped, but they are suspended." "Do you understand the difference?" "Yes, sir." "Good." A pause. "I also want you to know that I am aware of what happened in the Haroon district last night. I am aware of the sequence of events in the decisions that were made. I am not in the business of prejudging inquiries." Another pause. Longer. But I am also not in the business of allowing the institution I serve to be used to punish courage. And what you did last night was either courage or it was a UCMJ violation, and I intend to find out which. A beat. My guess is it was both, and we're going to have to figure out what we do with that. Are you willing to participate in a formal debrief? Sarah looked at Delaney, who had been listening on speaker and who was already nodding with the particular precise energy of someone who has been waiting for exactly this opening. Yes, sir, Sarah said, on the condition that my legal counsel is present. That is your right, and it will be honored. Lennox's voice had a quality that was difficult to categorize. Not warm, not cold, but something in between that felt like respect in the form of professionalism. 1,400 hours, Building C, bring your lawyer. He hung up. Sarah and Delaney looked at each other across the room. That, Delaney said carefully, is not what Hartwick wanted to happen this morning. No, Sarah looked at the phone in her hand. Is it enough? It's the beginning of enough. Delaney stood, picked up her legal pad. How are you doing? Actually doing? Sarah thought about it. She was tired in a way that went past physical. She had been awake for approximately 32 hours. She had spent part of those hours on a rooftop in a combat zone, firing a rifle at human beings, and she would have to live with that. And she had known she would have to live with that before she pulled the trigger the first time, and she had decided it was worth it. She still decided it was worth it. I'm okay, she said. You don't have to be okay. I know, but I am. She looked at the window, at the late morning light coming through it. I keep thinking about something. When I was on that rooftop, before the first shot, she paused. I said something, to no one. I said, forgive me. Delaney watched her. I don't know who I was asking. Maybe myself. Maybe just the moment, the choice. She looked back at Delaney. But I noticed that I didn't say, I'm sorry. I said, forgive me. And those are different things. How are they different? I'm sorry means you wish you hadn't done it. Forgive me means you did the right thing and it cost something anyway. She looked at her hands, at the hands that had been on the rifle, at the hands that were completely steady now. I'm not sorry. I would do it again. But it cost something. It always costs something. Delaney looked at her for a long moment. Then she wrote something on her legal pad, and Sarah didn't ask what it was. But she had a feeling it was something Delaney was going to say in her room later. The kind of thing that changes the temperature of a courtroom, not because it's legal argument, but because it's true. 1,027 hours. Hartwick sat in his office and understood, with the particular clarity of a man watching something he built begin to come apart, that the morning had not gone the way he planned. Lennox's visit had been the first wall. The inquiry suspension was the second. Alpha 6's debrief request, moving through formal channels with 9 signatures, was the third. And somewhere out there, a journalist had documentation that he could not retrieve, and could not suppress, and could not make disappear. He had spent 31 years building walls between himself and consequences, walls made of rank and institutional loyalty and the reliable tendency of military bureaucracy to protect its own. He had believed those walls were solid because he had never tested them against something like this. Against 12 men who survived when they were supposed to die, and a woman who fired when she was supposed to stay silent, and a corporal from Ohio who typed in the dark while everyone else was asleep. He picked up his phone, called his personal attorney, let it ring. The walls were still standing, but he could feel them. And in the supply room across the base, 9 Navy SEALs were figuring out what to say at 1,400 hours. And in her quarters, Sarah Vance was drinking her 3rd cup of coffee with a JAG captain who was already building something that was going to outlast any wall Hartwick had ever constructed. The day was not done, not even close. The 1,400 hours debrief was held in Building C, Room 14, which was a room designed for exactly this kind of reckoning. Long table, recorded audio, 2 cameras mounted in opposite corners, and enough chairs for everyone who needed to be present and no one who didn't. General Lennox sat at the head of the table. The Inspector General's counsel sat to his left with a laptop and a yellow legal pad, and the particular stillness of someone who processes information for a living and has learned not to react visibly to any of it. A court reporter sat at the far end. The recorder was running before anyone sat down. Alpha 6 came in first, all 9 of them. Torres had his wrist in a proper cast now, white and clean against his uniform. Webb's head bandage had been replaced with a smaller dressing, barely visible. Galvin looked like he hadn't slept, which he hadn't. Ramirez was not there. He was still in surgery recovery, which was exactly where he needed to be. But the 8 who were present sat down around that table with the specific, coordinated gravity of men who have agreed on something and intend to see it through. Reyes sat directly across from Lennox. He placed his hands flat on the table. He looked at the general with the steady eyes of a man who has decided that this room is where the truth lives today, and he is not leaving until it does. Sarah came in 2 minutes later with Delaney beside her. She sat down. She did not look at Lennox first. She looked at the men across the table, at Reyes. He looked back. Neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who understand each other completely without needing to perform that understanding for anyone watching. Then she looked at Lennox. "Sir, Specialist Vance." He looked at her for a moment, just looked. "Are you ready?" "Yes, sir." "Then we'll begin." 12 hours. Reyes went first. He spoke for 22 minutes without notes, without hesitation, without the kind of careful, diplomatic softening that soldiers sometimes use when speaking about their chain of command in formal settings. He spoke the way he had led Alpha 6 through the Haroun district, directly, in sequence, without wasted movement. He described the mission brief, the insertion, the moment Torres put up his fist in that alley. Every radio called a command, Hartwick's voice on the line, the words, "Let them finish it out there," and the silence that came after. He described what it felt like to tell 8 men that the helicopters were gone and QRF was stood down. He described Ramirez's leg and Galvan keeping him upright and Webb bleeding through a field dressing without breaking stride. He described the first shot from the rooftop 6 blocks north and how he knew, the way you know certain things in combat without being able to explain the mechanism of knowing, that whoever was firing for them. When he finished, the room was very quiet. The IG counsel typed something without looking up from his laptop. Lennox looked at Reyes for a moment and then said, "Thank you, Master Chief." That was all, 2 words. But the way he said them carried something that was not simply procedural acknowledgement. It carried weight. Webb went next. Webb's account was shorter and less formally organized and considerably more honest in its emotional texture. He said things like, "I was genuinely terrified for the first time in 6 years of doing this job," and "There's a specific feeling you get when you realize that the people above you have decided you're acceptable collateral damage, and I've never had that feeling before, and I don't want it again." The IG counsel typed faster during Webb's portion. 1,441 hours. When Sarah spoke, the room was different than it had been at the start. Something had accumulated in it. Testimony, truth, the specific weight of 9 men saying what happened. And what she added to that accumulation was the thing that only she could add, which was the inside of the decision. Not what she did, what she went through to do it. "I want to be clear about something," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that came from the same place as the steadiness of her hands on the rifle. Not the absence of emotion, but the management of it. "I did not make the decision I made because I thought I was right and command was wrong. I made the decision I made because 12 men were going to die, and I was the only person in a position to prevent it." She paused. "I knew what it was going to cost me. I made the choice with that knowledge. I would make it again." "You understood you were violating a direct order," the IG counsel said, not accusing, confirming. Yes. And you proceeded anyway? Yes. Why didn't you attempt to contact command again, to escalate through the chain? Because command had already answered. Colonel Hartwick had already told Alpha 6 to hold in place and wait. He had already cut their transmission. There was no version of going through the chain that resulted in those men surviving. She looked at the IG counsel directly. The chain had already made its decision. I made a different one. The IG counsel looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something on his legal pad. Sarah could not read it from across the table, but Delaney, seated beside her, angled her head by about 3 degrees and could see enough of the handwriting to make out 2 words. She didn't say them out loud. She wrote them on her own legal pad, turned it slightly towards Sarah, and tapped it once with her pen. The 2 words were, unlawful order. Sarah looked at the words. She looked at Delaney. Something settled in her chest that had been unsettled since approximately 2200 hours the previous night. 1503 hours. Hartwick was not in the building. His aide had told Lennox's office at 1330 that the colonel had a prior commitment and would be unavailable until 1600. The prior commitment was his personal attorney, who had arrived at the base at 12:45 in a rental car and was currently sitting with Hartwick in a room that was decidedly not Building C, working through the particular kind of mathematics that men in Hartwick's position work through when they feel a structure beginning to list. The attorney's name was Gerald Foss, and he had spent 30 years doing exactly this kind of work. Not defending guilt exactly, but managing it, shaping narratives, finding the version of events that was technically defensible, and making it the dominant one before the alternative version had time to gain purchase. He was very good at his job, and he was good at it because he understood something essential. The truth was not a fixed object. It was a story, and stories could be told in more than one way. Here's what we have, Foss said, not opening with pleasantries because Hartwick was not paying him for pleasantries. The charges against Vance are technically sound. The violations she committed are real violations. If this goes to a court-martial on the charge sheet as written, we have a defensible case on the grounds of command authority and operational discipline. But, Hartwick said, because he could hear the but even when Foss didn't say it yet, but the context is going to be very difficult to manage. 9 seals on record, an IG inquiry, a journalist with time-stamped documentation. Foss set his pen down. And there's something else. I spoke with someone at the publication this morning, Helen Marsh's editor. The documentation Marsh has includes the radio log of you cutting Alpha 6's transmission, not ordering a stand-down, not redirecting assets, the actual act of physically cutting the transmission while they were calling for help. He paused. That is not a narrative problem, Colonel. That is a facts problem. Hartwick was quiet. If that gets published, and it will get published, the charge sheet against Vance becomes a catastrophic error. Because then the story is not insubordinate soldier disobeys orders. The story is Colonel silences dying men and then prosecutes the woman who saved them. And that story has a kind of momentum that legal proceedings cannot stop. What are you recommending? Foss looked at him steadily. I'm recommending that you make a decision about what you want to protect. Your career, the institution, or the charge sheet. He let that sit for a moment. Because I don't think you can protect all 3. 15, 18 hours. The knock on Building C, Room 14's door, came during a 5-minute recess. Lennox's aide opened it and spoke quietly to the general, who listened with the expression of someone receiving information they had been expecting but had hoped to receive under different circumstances. He said 2 words to his aide, and the aide closed the door, and Lennox turned to the room. Colonel Hartwick has requested to join the debrief, he said. The room absorbed this. Reyes looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Reyes. Neither of them said anything. Webb leaned slightly toward Torres and said, under his breath, "He's here." I noticed, Torres said. What does that mean? That he's here? It means his lawyer told him that not being here was worse than being here.
Lennox looked around the room.
Objections? Delaney's hand went up. Counsel requests clarification on Colonel Hartwick's status in this proceeding. Is he here as a witness or as a subject of the inquiry? Both, the IG counsel said, without looking up from his laptop. As of approximately 40 minutes ago, the scope of this inquiry was expanded to include command decisions made during the operation in question. He looked up now. Colonel Hartwick will be advised of this upon entry. The door opened. Hartwick came in alone. His aide was not with him, and Foss was not with him, which told the room something about the calculation he had made in the last hour. A man who brings his attorney into a room is defending himself. A man who comes in alone is doing something different. He stood at the threshold for a moment, and the room looked at him, and he looked at the room, and Reyes understood immediately what he was seeing in Hartwick's face. It was not fear. Hartwick was not a man who feared things in the conventional sense. What was there was something more specific. The look of a man who has run every remaining path in his head and has arrived at the one that cost the least while conceding the most. He sat down. Colonel, Lennox said, you understand that this proceeding is being recorded and that your participation constitutes formal testimony. Yes, sir. And you've been advised that the scope of this inquiry now includes command decisions made during the operation. Yes, sir. Good. Lennox's expression did not change. Then let's continue. 15:31 hours. The next 47 minutes were the most extraordinary thing that any of the people in that room had ever witnessed in a military setting. And several of them would spend years afterward trying to describe it accurately to people who weren't there, and mostly failing. Because the thing that made it extraordinary was not dramatic in the conventional sense. There was no shouting, no breakdown, no cinematic moment of confession. What happened was something quieter and more complete. A man, piece by piece, telling the truth. Hartwick started with the operation. He described the mission parameters, the intelligence assessment, the decision-making process at command level. He was precise and professional, and he spoke in the language of operational logic, the language of risk calculation and diplomatic sensitivity and asset management. And then the IG counsel asked him about the radio, and he stopped. And the stopping lasted 4 full seconds, which in a recorded debrief is a very long time. Colonel, the IG counsel said, the radio transmission from Alpha 6 at approximately 03:37 hours. Walk us through your decision process. Hartwick looked at his hands. He looked at them the way Sarah had looked at hers earlier that morning, and she noticed the similarity and felt something complicated move through her that was not sympathy exactly, but was in the same family. I made a decision, Hartwick said, based on the information I had at the time, to limit the operational footprint in the Haroun district in order to prevent an international incident. He paused. The transmission was cut to prevent further escalation. While Alpha 6 was calling for extraction. Yes. While they were reporting wounded and requesting QRF. Yes. And the QRF had already been stood down. Yes. And the extraction helicopters had been redirected. Yes. The IG counsel was quiet for a moment. Colonel, in your professional assessment, at the time you cut that transmission, what was the likely outcome for Alpha 6? The silence was absolute. The court reporter's fingers were still. The cameras in the corners were running. 12 people in that room were holding their breath without knowing they were holding it. The likely outcome, Hartwick said very slowly, was that not all of them would make it out. How many did you expect to survive? Another pause, longer this time. I did not expect high survival rates. Meaning you expected most of them to die. He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he said, the diplomatic consequences of a visible military engagement in the Haroun district that night would have been significant. The calculation was that the cost of... He stopped. He looked at Reyes across the table. Reyes was looking back at him, not with anger, with the particular direct attention of a man who has decided to make someone see him. The calculation was that the cost of the engagement outweighed. "Colonel," Lennox's voice was quiet and precise as a blade. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it plainly. Yes or no. Did you make an operational decision to leave American soldiers to die in order to protect a diplomatic outcome?" The longest silence of the entire proceeding. "Yes," Hartwick said. 18 hours. The room emptied in stages after Lennox formally closed the recording at 16:12. The IG counsel left immediately with his laptop under his arm and his yellow legal pad covered in writing. The court reporter packed her equipment. The Alpha 6 men filed out in a loose group, quiet in the specific way of people who have just watched something large and heavy fall and are still processing the sound of it landing. Reyes was the last of the SEALs to leave. At the door, he stopped. He turned back. Hartwick was still sitting at the table, and he was alone now except for Lennox, who was standing by the window with his arms behind his back. Reyes looked at Hartwick for a moment. Not long, just enough. Then he left. In the hallway, Webb fell into step beside him. "How are you feeling?" "Like I need about 16 hours of sleep." "That's not what I asked." "I know." Reyes walked for a moment without answering. "He said yes," he finally said. "He was in that room, and they asked him directly, and he said yes." "Yeah. I don't know what I thought, that he'd find a way to not say it, that the language would be different, that it would be some version of, 'No, it wasn't like that. Here's the context.'" He shook his head. He said yes. "Does that change anything? For you?" Reyes thought about it. "It doesn't change what happened, but it changes what happens next." He stopped walking. He looked at Webb. "It means there's no version of this where he wins. Not in that room with that recording. There's no spin on a yes." Webb considered this. "Good," he said, simply and completely. "Good." 16:41 hours. Sarah was in the hallway outside the room when Reyes found her. Delaney had gone to make calls. The journalist, the IG office, the cascade of procedural contacts that followed a day like this one. And Sarah was standing alone against the wall with her arms crossed and her eyes on the middle distance. Reyes stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. He was taller than she'd imagined from the radio voice, and she had pictured him in the abstract all morning. The Master Chief, the professional, the man whose voice had pulled her off her bunk at 2200 hours. And now he was standing in front of her in a hallway, and he was a person, just a person, tired and alive in the exact proportion that last night had almost rearranged. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you," he said. "You don't have to say anything." "I know. I'm going to anyway." He looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention that was clearly just how he looked at things. No performance in it, no management, just presence. "What you did last night, 90 seconds, 10 shots. You did what none of the people with the authority to do it were willing to do. And you did it knowing what it was going to cost you. And there is not a man on my team who is going to let that stand without doing everything in our power to make sure the record says what actually happened." He paused. "We're going to testify at your court-martial if it comes to that. All of us. Whatever comes next, you are not going through it alone." Sarah looked at him. She had been holding herself together very precisely since approximately 05:01 hours that morning, with the discipline of someone who understands that the time to process is after, not during, and the during part was not yet finished. She had been running on coffee and legal strategy and the particular fierce focus of a person who has made a choice and is defending it. And she had not let herself think too much about the weight of it, because the weight of it had no useful function while the work was still happening. But hearing this from him, from this man whose voice she had followed into a decision she couldn't take back, something shifted. I know, she said. I know you will. She looked at the wall, at the floor, back at him. Can I ask you something? Yeah. When you heard the first shot, on the radio, you said they're on our side before you knew who it was. Yeah. How did you know? Reyes thought about it for a moment. Because the shot was in the right place, he said. Whoever fired that shot had looked at the whole situation and understood exactly what needed to happen. And when someone looks at your situation and understands what needs to happen and then does it, he paused. That's not an enemy. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. Not for the statement, for something larger and harder to name. And he understood that because he just nodded. Then Torres appeared at the end of the hallway and called, Master Chief. And Reyes said, Go, and walked toward him. And Sarah watched him go. And then Delaney appeared from the other direction with her phone in one hand and her legal pad in the other. And her expression had changed in the way expressions change when something has moved significantly in your direction. The IG counsel just contacted me, Delaney said. The charge sheet is being withdrawn. Sarah stared at her. Withdrawn, not suspended, withdrawn. The inquiry's preliminary assessment is that your actions fall under the legal doctrine of necessity, that you acted to prevent a greater harm when no lawful alternative was available. Delaney's voice was still doing the thing where it stayed precise and controlled, but her eyes were doing something different. They're also recommending that Command's actions last night be referred to a formal investigation for potential violations of military law. Sarah stood very still. It's not over, Delaney said quickly. There will be hearings. There will be more proceedings. Hartwick has lawyers, and the institution has inertia, and none of this resolves in a week. But the charge sheet is gone, Sarah. They're not prosecuting you. Outside the building, it was late afternoon on Christmas Day, and the light was going gray and low. And somewhere across the base, a group of soldiers was singing something that sounded like a carol, distant and slightly off-key and entirely sincere. Sarah stood in the hallway and felt the day's full weight arrive in her body at once. The sleeplessness, the rooftop, the shots, the hours of testimony, the coffee and the legal pads, and the radioed voice of a colonel saying, "Let them finish it out there." She sat down on a bench in the hallway. Delaney sat beside her. They didn't speak for a while. 1729 hours. The Federal Military Review published Helen Marsh's article at 1729 hours on Christmas Day. The headline read, 12 SEALs abandoned by command on Christmas Eve. One soldier defied orders to save them all. Marsh's article ran 4,200 words and included the time-stamped radio transcripts, Pritchard's detailed account of events in the command center, and a statement from Brigadier General Lennox confirming that an independent inquiry had been opened into command decisions made during the operation. It did not quote Sarah directly. That had been the agreement, 48 hours notice before publication. But it described her actions with a precision that made quotation unnecessary. The article was shared 11,000 times in the first hour. By midnight, it had reached members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. By the following morning, it had a name that people kept using when they referenced it, the way articles sometimes acquire a name that isn't their headline. People were calling it the Christmas Eve story, and they were sharing it with parents and siblings and veterans they knew and people they'd never met. And the thing that struck most of them, the thing they kept coming back to in the comments and the shares and the calls they made to people they loved, was not the tactical details or the institutional failures or even the legal outcome. It was the image of a woman on a rooftop in the dark, making a decision she knew would cost her everything, and making it anyway. 90 seconds, 10 shots, not one wasted, not one hesitation after the first. Hartwick was placed on administrative leave pending the formal investigation on December 26th. He did not contest it. Pritchard was transferred to a new assignment at his own request in January, and his record showed no disciplinary action, which was the only acknowledgement the institution was capable of making for what he had done in the dark with a personal device and a contact he'd kept in his wallet. Elroy received a quiet commendation that she told no one about because that was how she preferred to operate, and she kept operating that way because that was also who she was. Stills was promoted the following spring, and when people asked him why he'd walked out of Hartwick's office without being dismissed that morning, he said he genuinely couldn't remember making the decision to do it. He said it felt less like a choice and more like the natural end of a calculation he'd been running for 21 years without knowing it. Ramirez walked out of the medical bay on January 3rd with a cane and the firm's stated intention of never using it past February. He was right. He didn't need it past February. Galvin slept for 17 hours after the debrief and woke up and went back to work. Webb had his stitches out on January 5th and told the medic who removed them that she could express sympathy now if she wanted. She did. He didn't discourage it. Torres bought a small notebook and began writing things in it that he never showed anyone, because some things are processed in words on paper, and some things are processed in other ways. And Torres had always been better at the quiet kind. And Sarah, the court-martial never happened. The formal hearing that replaced it took 3 days in February and produced a ruling that was 12 pages long and took 11 of those pages to say what could have been said in one, that what she did was right, not legal, not sanctioned, not within the framework of military protocol, but right, in the way that certain things are right when the framework fails. And the only alternative to acting is watching something irreversible happen to people who trusted someone to prevent it. She was not promoted. She was not formally commended. The institution was capable of acknowledging that she had not committed a crime, but it was not yet capable of the larger acknowledgement, the one that would require it to look at itself directly and reckon with what it had been willing to do on Christmas Eve in the Haroun district. She understood this. She had always understood this was how it would go. She had climbed that rooftop knowing that the best outcome available to her was survival, not triumph. And she had made her peace with that before the first shot, and she did not unmake it now. She left the Army in March. Honorable discharge. She stood in the processing office and signed the paperwork and walked out into the spring air and stood on the pavement outside the building for a moment, breathing. Her phone buzzed. A message from Reyes. 2 words. Thank you. She typed back 2 words. Worth it. She put her phone in her pocket and started walking, and the day was cold and clear and completely ordinary, and she was alive in it. And across the base, in a supply room with metal shelves and antiseptic floors and a single overhead light, 12 names were written on a piece of paper that Torres had taped to the wall the morning after Christmas and never taken down. Not as a memorial, as a record, as a reminder that 12 men had gone into an alley on Christmas Eve and come back out because one woman on a rooftop had decided that the math of leaving them there was a math she refused to accept. Some decisions cannot be undone. Some things once done belong to history in a way that no official account can fully reclaim. Sarah Vance fired 10 shots in 90 seconds, and the 12 men who are alive because of those shots will carry that fact with them for the rest of their lives. And the colonel who put his hand on a radio console and cut the signal to dying men will carry his version of that night too. And the distance between those two kinds of carrying is the distance between a life lived towards something and a life lived away from it. She knew which side of that distance she was on. She had known it on the rooftop. She had known it before she ever pulled the trigger, and she would know it every morning for the rest of her life. And that knowing would be enough, because it was the truth. And the truth, once you have paid the full price for it, is something no one can ever take back from you.